People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
Diagnóza jedinca na pozadí chorej spoločnosti.
Na štedrý večer budem mať zase službu, kvôli tomu, že som slobodná.
Čo má v živote naozaj hodnotu? Kde zlyhával režim a kde zlyhávame my sami? Hraný debut Dušana Hanáka 322. V sobotu o 20:10 na Dvojke.
Welcome to the projection booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again is Mr. Jonathan Owen.
Hello, happy Czetchtember.
Also back in the booth is Ms. Angela Mack.
Very nice to be back. Thank you.
Czetchtember continues with one from Slovakian filmmaker Dušan Hanák, 322. Released in 1969, the film was banned immediately after its premiere. We'll be discussing why and ruining the film as we go along, so if you don't want anything ruined, please turn off the podcast and come back after you've seen it. Pro tip, the movie is available in full with English subtitles on archive.org. So, Jonathan, when was the first time you saw 322 and what did you think?
I think I saw it maybe about 15 years ago, and I'd seen quite a lot of the Czechoslovak New Wave films by then. And it was probably the second film that I saw by Hanák. I must admit that the first time I saw it, I don't think it fully landed with me because I think there's so much going on in it. And I think in comparison with some of the other like Slovak films of that time, it's quite subtle and restrained, and I probably just found it a little difficult to get a handle on when I first saw it. I was impressed, though, by the visuals, I think, by the editing, the composition. I think I was just also really taken by the fact that there were hippies in Bratislava in 1969, and subsequently other films I've seen have confirmed that. And yeah, I think I was very taken with the Vladko character.
And Angela, how about yourself? Was this the first time viewing for you?
God, this feels familiar. And then I got to the slaughterhouse part. It was like, oh, I have started to watch this before. And then I thought we were getting into like Cannibal Holocaust territory or something and turned it off. I had only watched the bad parts and then missed the rest of the movie. So I was glad that you steered me towards it because I'm glad I watched it. It certainly lingers in your mind. And honestly, I don't know if we could actually spoil, even though you could tell a person everything about it. It's an experience, certainly.
It definitely is. And yeah, I think it might be better. This one might be better to listen to our episode first, just because, yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on in here. This was a first time watch for me. So you guys both have one up on me. I first heard of this film because even though I found an article where this was voted the best Slovakian film of all time, and a lot of those films, it's nice, are all from the 60s. My sweet spot with this stuff, but it definitely has given me a lot of good things to look up. I hadn't heard of it until I watched Martin Sulik did that whole series of the Golden 60s, but plus he also did one called 25 from the 60s, or the Czechoslovak New Wave, that he directed and Jan Lucas wrote, and that's where I first heard of this film, and just the visuals from it were so striking that I wrote it down, was just like, I have to see this movie. I want to talk about it on Czetchtember because it just feels right up my street, and it didn't disappoint. This is a movie where I was like, okay, these are the kind of things. This almost, we talk about the Czech New Wave, we talk about avant-garde films, but this feels really out there. It's maybe not as out there as something like Daisies, but it's very avant-garde.
One of the interesting things about the way that the two different parts of Czechoslovak cinema develop during that time is that obviously people, I think, generally are more familiar with the Czech side, and I guess Czech cinema has a longer history as an institutionalized film industry, and Slovakia is often seen as the one that was slower to develop as a set of institutions. And yet in the 60s, you see this development where, I guess by the end of the 60s, I would say that some of the things that the Slovak filmmakers are doing are almost outdoing what the Czech filmmakers were doing in terms of just their commitment to the avant-garde and to experimentation. And it's just people like Hanák, Jacobisko in a more kind of overt or extravagant way. They're just really throwing things at you that are very experimental. And as you say, it really delivers. If you want that kind of avant-garde 60s experience, this really does deliver as that.
Speaking as an American, there's just so much propaganda about the communism and the Eastern Bloc and just the oppression that it almost paints everything gray and drab, that you just assume the books are gray and drab. Like you hear about like War and Peace and things like that, that you're not really jumping at the bit to read, or it's not going to be this exciting psychedelic experience. And yet all of this was being created. It's just such a travesty that it was buried for so long, not being able to get out into the rest of the world until the late 80s. And I'm so glad that the projection booth can cover things like this and get it out there.
Not a ton of podcasts on 322, as far as I've found. There might be a whole group that's doing that, but I haven't found them yet.
They're probably R-rated. Something that I love about 60s European cinema is the Americans did it too, but I think a little more, it's just a different angle. So it's surprising to me to see it, that the sexuality that's discussed is just so much more casually brought to bear. There are so many nods to sexuality in this, just aside from the cuckolding, but seeing so many ladies bending over and nods to things that people would find arousing. Western cinema has to ham-fist those things or shy away from them. It's like they're either blatant or skirted around. So it was nice to see it through, and especially that grappling with oppression through sexuality in a way.
It's very striking, and just the visuals for this. And of course, I love visual rhymes, and I'm just seeing visual rhymes throughout this whole thing, even from the attack on our main character in the beginning of this film and how these thugs, youth, put shaving cream all over his face. And then later on, we see his ex-wife and how she's putting cold cream on her face. And there's a moment where she moves from one room, I think, into another room, and she's got the cold cream on both places, but I think they're separated by time and space, but the cold cream ties the rooms together, which is interesting.
When he gets the cream on his face, it's not a good end, and it's compromising to him, but he's accepting of it. Whereas when she has the cold cream on her face, she's expecting happiness from it. Like she has a totally different set, and she's not going to accept any, or she's at least not going to feel satisfied with anything less than that. But it was so smartly done. How brilliantly done.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it, with the shaving cream at the beginning? And I think it takes maybe a couple of viewings to get what's going on there, isn't it? And you have one of the thugs is carrying the shaving brush on the top of his head at the beginning, and then he's actually like lathering it on Lauko's face, and it's easy to miss that. You just see the cream on his face, and you think like, where has that come from? And then, second viewing, you get what they're doing, because it's such a strange thing as a sort of a method of assault. It's very original, isn't it? It's a very strange thing to do. And then, he's forced to thank them. And I guess you get that idea of like masks, don't you, really? And I guess shaving is an ambiguous image. It's a way of revealing the face, isn't it? Whereas what she's doing, she's like masking her face, and it's all about the display and the consumption. And there's a lot of those loaded motifs like that, really. There's a lot of imagery of like eyes and of covered eyes as well, isn't there? I think you get the eyes of the cattle, you get like you get, of course, Josef Abrhám with those joke glasses that he's wearing. You get the sunglasses that Marta wears when she crashes. And you get the blindfolded cow. And yeah, there's a lot of imagery of like covered eyes, and there's probably multiple meanings that you can get from that.
Well, there was that odd at the beginning there, one of the thugs was female, and it almost looked like pieces of paper instead of eyelashes that she had glued on. It was so bizarre. And I was hoping there'd be an explanation later. But there wasn't.
And yeah, in one scene, Josef Abrhám is walking around with sunglasses on that only have one lens in it. And then later on, you see a still image of Lauko's wife, and she's got the sunglasses on with one glass in it. Because we should probably say this right here at the beginning. This movie, like I said, is avant-garde. So they're doing a lot of interesting things in here. There's a lot of still frames. There's some animation, which we'll talk about in a bit, but the little things like the apple disintegrating, that's actually Jan Svankmajer. I didn't realize that he did that. And that actually covers some material that was cut out of the film. So what we're watching is actually a slightly censored version. That original version does exist, but with burned in subtitles on there. German subtitles, I believe, which is also interesting because you get a lot of languages in here. Even during the opening credits, there's people talking and it's not subtitled. And I'm just like, okay. And then throughout the movie, and I don't know if this was just a bad subtitling job or not, but there were a lot of times where people would say things and they weren't being subtitled, which was a real pain. But especially like on-screen titles and quotes and things like that. Even during the opening credits, you have those like very stark stenciled credit letters, and then you have the fragmented body parts that look like they're being taken right out of like Grey's Anatomy or something. And you have the whispering stuff going on. And I'm just like, oh, I'm in for a ride with this movie. It's already presenting me with three very disparate things just right here in the opening credits.
The opening credits, even though it had that grating sound, there was like a tension sound or grinding. I don't know how it would grinding your nerves, but it was exciting. That it was like, oh, this is something.
It probably takes a second viewing, at least it did for me, to realize that kind of harsh sound over the credits is actually the sound of the machine during his scans, isn't it, later in the hospital? There's like an interplay, I think, in his work between diegetic and non-diegetic sounds. So the sounds that could be part of the movie's world, and then the sounds that are just being layered on as part of the kind of formal arrangement. And it's sometimes difficult to know. And often it happens, I think, Mike, you mentioned this in your notes, that it's sometimes difficult to tell where voices are coming from and who's speaking. And the sound really is very playfully used, isn't it really? Sound and voices and captions, they are an element in their own right. As you said, like with the captions, they're not really designed to illustrate or clarify the action, but they are texts that I guess work in interesting ways with the images. So you're meant to think about them and compare or contrast with what's happening on screen. And they're never really doing a sort of just a simple thing. They may be quoting sometimes from the dialogue, but that in itself is interesting because you think, why? What is it doing there? Why is it highlighting this line or this idea? And one of the ones that I find particularly amusing for some reason is you get that caption that says the influences of literature, which comes up twice. And I still haven't worked out what is the point of that. I'm wondering maybe because I guess the sort of whole Marta plot is the part that comes most directly from the original story. So maybe it's indicating that was closer to the original text, but even that doesn't seem satisfying really. So yeah, there is that constant sort of playful juxtaposition. It reminds me a lot of Makeyev actually, although I think they have quite different techniques. But I was thinking a lot of the switchboard operator, especially as I was watching this, and there were even specific things that reminded me. I think one of the things especially was when you have that couple, they seem to be on stage performing, and although it's black and white, they seem to be painted gold and in various kind of tableau. And there's like elderly people in the audience watching in a kind of bemused way. And yeah, that really reminded me of the switchboard operator. And I think just as you do in switchboard operator, you have that feeling of it's like a society itself that's almost like a collage too, because it's this juxtaposition of you have very traditional styles and traditional ways of life, and then you have this very modern element, very kind of 60s style, Western style clothing or cosmetics or kind of commercial products. And then you have the sense of this older, more traditional society where you have, say, chickens wandering around and people in the kind of the traditional costume. And it's almost like the society itself is this hodgepodge of different things, just as the style is.
Yeah, whenever I talk about visual rhymes, I always think of Makeyev and just the way that he would bring in things, and then you had to, because he would always have multimedia stuff going on. So like you would introduce documentaries and introduce still images and all of these things, and you could pick up on, oh, that thing from that documentary is very similar to this. Or you'd have fake documentaries like in Switchboard Operator, where you had the little movie about ridding the city of rats. And then you find out that the boyfriend in that is a rat catcher, and oh, he's actually in the documentary. I think that was all staged. I thought it was real at first. Or even Man is Not a Bird, where you get like the ideal Soviet images countered with what people are actually doing and just how slovenly and just trying to get along in life that they are. They're not these men of marble, to coin a phrase. And with this one, it's a simple story at the heart of this. For me, it's really a story of a relationship and a man with cancer. But as far as I can tell, and now please correct me if I'm wrong, Lauko, our main character, played by Václav Lohniský, he doesn't get told throughout the entire film that he has cancer. And does he even have cancer? Does he come out with a clean bill of health at the end?
I assume he had the gallstones, and that was just spreading infection in his system. Or I assume at the end he is healthy, but I wasn't 100% on that, which I think is the problem, that maybe the truth of the communism is that they'll tell you what they want and you have to take it. So 322, but he wasn't even told.
He wasn't told that, because 322, the title of this is the medical coding at this time for cancer. And yeah, I think it's our old friend Miroslav Machacek from Fifth Horseman is Fear in here. Great seeing him show up again. And he doesn't seem to be his bedside manner could be better as a doctor.
I love the fact that he asked Lauko about smoking, and then in the same scene, he himself is actually smoking, and he has a big bottle of, I think, maybe whiskey or something on his desk. And yeah, slightly rather relaxed approach. In regard to the illness, I got the same feeling. I think that probably he's okay at the end, but yes, it leaves you hanging. It doesn't have that big moment of relief. And I guess there is a tone. The tone is one of relief or of affirmation, but it doesn't link that explicitly to him having a clean bill of health. But yes, I think we are meant to construe that it was just the gallstones and that those are past. And I think by the time you get to the end of the movie, it's preoccupied with another level, really. I think it's more, I guess we might say, like a spiritual, psychological kind of relief that he's going through at the end. And yes, it doesn't really give you that kind of moment of clarification, really. And yeah, I think that use of the number is really interesting too, isn't it? The 322, because I think that's another kind of recurring motif throughout the film, I think, isn't it? The idea of numbers and bureaucracy and the way people and things are categorized or codified. And you have the children with the number tags, you have the cattle with the number tags. And one of my favorite things is that you have the hippie character Vladko, who has his I believe it's his like identity number that he's painted on the back of his coat. So he's taken that principle of like classification and turned it into a kind of art object. And that's a beautiful piece of subversion, I think.
So we've got the whole story of the cancer with Lauko. And then we also find out that Lauko, who works in a restaurant, he lives with his ex-wife, and again, please correct me if I'm wrong on any of this stuff, lives with his ex-wife, and she's having an affair with Josef Abrhám, who plays Peter, and they're pretty open about it. She's definitely an older woman for him. I love seeing him show up and stuff, and I always find him to be such a great actor. And at this point in his career, he's just so handsome, I think. And I always find him very captivating. So those two going at it together. And then there's also at one point another woman that shows up, and he is, maybe I should go with this younger woman, but we get to see a little bit of him at work. And mostly it's him and Marta just going out and dating and doing their thing. And you do get to see them not necessarily en flagrante, but you see them sharing a bed together. And at one point, Lauko even walks in on them. And like you were saying, Angela, with the cuckolding, he's just like, oh, hey, yeah, you left your light on or whatever. I thought, sorry, I didn't realize anybody was up. It's like, okay, just walks right out. And then, yeah, you've mentioned Vladko a few times. Vladko's the wild card for me, because there are times with Vladko, the hippie, where I'm just like, is this guy even real? Is he a spirit that's been conjured up? Because he just seems to like show up. He hangs out with Lauko at times. Lauko's in the hospital. All of a sudden, Vladko's there as well, talking about glasses and eye stuff. He puts on the one patient's really super thick Coke bottle glasses, and he's wandering around in the room with his arms outstretched like Frankenstein. And you're just like, does anybody else see this guy? Like I wrote in my notes, is he a ghost? I don't get this guy.
There was an interview with, Michael's tripping over all these names, and okay. The director, so he has a strong background in doing documentaries, and I guess it kind of merges, which makes sense. You wouldn't have thought it watching it, but thinking about it after and reading about it, Vladko, in reality, the actor was a hippie nearby and some nudist hippies hanging out in the woods kind of commune. Hanák he wanted to film them and wanted to just capture that freedom on film. So I guess the character of Vladko is a mixture of basically him just being given a very small directive and doing his thing, which seems right because he's so whimsical and just so captivating. And then it seems so right. That's him. And there's so little, like I tried to look up things about it. There's nothing, like he's into movies and doesn't exist otherwise. And he was so talented in film. Like I would have loved to have seen more with him.
Yeah, he's such a just naturally sympathetic presence, isn't he, really? And that's right about the documentary. I think that's a really important point to bring up, really, because, yeah, Hanák, by this point, had only made documentaries. This was his first feature film, his first narrative feature. And despite the fact that at the beginning it's clear to tell you that this is a work of fiction, it is very much like an integration of documentary and fictional techniques. And I guess interesting in terms of Hanák's career, because I think this is really the only place where he fuses like a narrative feature film with the kind of techniques that he was using in his documentary work, whereas his other films tend to be, they're either documentaries in a kind of poetic, like essay style, or they are more kind of straightforward narrative features. And I guess this is the one where he's doing both together. And probably one of the reasons why it is rather overwhelming, I think, first viewing, because, yeah, I think the kind of the narrative, the fictional narrative, it's not that it gets lost, but it just blends together, doesn't it, with a lot of the other things that are going on. And I think in regard to the use of like non-professional actors, like the guy playing Vladko, I think that, again, I think fits in with, I think Hanák being really interested in, he was really interested, I think, in the happening, like the idea of the happening. And he made a film a few years later called Day of Joy, which is a good title because it is a really joyful short film about this. It was actually a record of a happening by a Slovak artist called Alex Mlinačík. And that's full of this kind of imagery of these kind of like young hippies and people just celebrating. It's all about this train ride, and it's just really hard to imagine that this was made like 4 years after the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And yeah, I think he was really captivated by that sense of just like joyful anarchy and of this sense of being an outsider. I think this is like an important idea for him. He's really fascinated by the outsider. And one thing I love about the street scenes in the film is I think it does show that it's that kind of ambiguity, isn't it? I guess on the one hand that you have this sense of control that's ever present. You have the police car. You have these, at one point there's this strange voiceover, isn't there? Like announcing like prohibitions and telling people what to do and what not to do. But then in other scenes, you have these beautiful kind of just demonstrations of this anarchic freedom. And it's almost like he's filming there's a constant like street theater going on.
What's so interesting, I think one of the very first times that you meet Vladko, you see him and there's a off-duty cop that starts harassing him, and the camera's I believe it's inside of a place, and Vladko's outside, as is the cop, and Vladko's just walking and talking with this guy, and the camera's panning along with them, and we are, like I said, we're inside the building. And as the camera pans, there's a guy standing there inside of the building. It almost looks like he's wearing like a Groucho Marx nose and glasses. And I'm just like, is this the secret police? What is going on? And they just move right past him. That's the scene or the shot that I saw, I believe, in that documentary. Plus, it was definitely in that Golden 60s episode about Hanák. And I'm just like, okay, we're not going to talk about that at all. But just to have this person standing there draws so much attention to itself, and I love it.
There are so many small nods, like the thugs at the beginning. One guy has a mask on the back of his head, and
right.
It's interesting the disguises that are just subtly done in the background almost along the way that are just never explained.
The other thing I didn't mention about this is that mirrors are everywhere in this film. And there are so many times where you think you're looking at a real object, quote unquote. I know everything's, reproduced because it's film, but we're looking at something and you realize, oh, we're actually looking at the reflection. I mean, even just like little things like when we go to Macharek's office and he's taking the little mirror and putting over the flame, and then he's got a big mirror on the doctor's cap or whatever you call that thing, like how it reflects the light and all that. I mean, that's just one example, but you get mirrors constantly. There's even talking about the street scenes. Oh, just a random dude carrying a mirror across the street. It's like they are every place in the movie, and it's wild how much they integrate into this. And the camera work required to do some of these shots with these reflections is fantastic, as well as just like when they introduce the character of Sisnik. Eventually we find out she's a pregnant woman. And one of the first times we see her, it's maybe the second shot she's in, there's a guy in the back, I want to say he's like the Maitre D or something. He's filling these glasses with fruit juice and then watering it down. And we go from him, we rack to another guy, and then we rack to Sisnik. Yes, to Sisnik. I'm just like, that's so nice. This like triple rack focus that we're doing. Just little things like that. But I'm just like, this is really well shot.
You see why he's one of the, what was it? Out of 16 people in the program, right. He was like the 4 that finished. Yeah, one of the few FAMU graduates of that class. It's so weird that some habits never die in film. That one of the cutest girls in the movie is supposed to be less than average looking. It's like, she's one of the cutest ones. She alluded to a lover that she had, so I assume the lover had. But then again, I hope that the main character ended up with her. I mean, it was my impression that he did. I don't know if everyone else feels that way, but. And who got her pregnant? Was that our main character or was that somebody else?
Another of the few things that are actually in the story as well, I think, isn't it? I think that the still subplot and the story, I think it does seem to indicate that, yes, she's pregnant by another lover. But yes, it does establish the relationship, I think, a bit more solidly than in the film. But yeah, hopefully they do go off together at the end. And in regard to pregnancy, that just reminded me as well about the scene with Josef Abrhám at the end with the girl, the other student. And that's another interesting scene, isn't it? Because initially she tells him she's expecting and that it's his. And then she just says that she lied. And I don't think there's any other mention of that at any earlier point. And we don't really get what the relationship is between them. And I think Abraham's character at one point also says to Marta, Lauko's wife, that he's a virgin. So we don't know, has he slept with the other girl? It's very kind of unclear, isn't it? I think the sort of that set of relationships.
Yeah, and then who's to believe what? You know, when she tells him, "Oh, I'm pregnant," and then within 2 minutes, "Now I lied." I'm like, wow, okay, no mystery here.
And the cadence these things are done with, it almost, I mean, it brings to mind like absurdism to me when you're reading something and it's just so abrupt of this thing happened, this disjointed thing happened. And there seems to be a touch of that throughout it, of just things blatantly happening that have no rhyme or reason to anything else, unless you really think about it, and maybe you could draw a line between the two. At the opening I thought it was so tremendous, of someone who has lost faith but hasn't the courage not to believe. It tells you straight up that's what the movie's about. But as you're watching it, I don't know if I would have ever concluded that on my own. Of all the threads I would have weaved together, I don't think belief or faith or not to believe, it would never have come up for me.
It doesn't really do anything very explicit with that, does it? With that idea of faith. It's definitely not religious faith or political faith. There's a critic of Václav Lohniský who's written quite a lot about Hanák. And I guess his interpretation is it's simply this just affirmation at the end of humanity. So I guess that's as much of a faith as we can have at the end. And you get that scene. I guess, again, Vladko is quite significant here, isn't he? Because I think if, to the extent that he is, that's why I like the idea that he may be a ghost or he may just be the simply symbolic figure, because I guess in and of itself, the fact that he kind of bonds and forms his friendship with Lauko is a little bit improbable, isn't it? Anyway, but I think that, he does have a symbolic purpose by the end of the movie, because, I guess he's showing Lauko those drawings, isn't he? And he's they're naming things like apple, meadow, tree, isn't it? I think. And I guess relating back to the image of the apple that decays. So I guess you've got a kind of an inversion of that. So you're seeing earlier on this apple that decays. And then at the end, I guess you have this image of the apple. And I don't know whether I'm like over reading. Maybe I've just watched Kytilovar's films too much, but I'm thinking there is a kind of like an Edenic motif there somehow, but it could also be paganistic as well, because it's things to do with nature. I guess there is some kind of affirmation, but as you say, it's obscure as to what kind of faith or what kind of affirmation that it's really showing us.
And this is yet another movie that I see from Czechoslovakia during this time that has butterflies in it. I don't know if it was a cultural thing or a symbolism thing, but there are always, not always, but there are so many butterflies that are in movies, and this is yet another one where you even have Vladko going into a bookstore and picking up a book about caterpillars and butterflies, and then there's, in the doctor's office, there's a big butterfly over one's shoulder, and I'm just like, all right, I mean, of course, butterflies, transformation, but I'm surprised it wasn't what I usually see in these movies, which is butterflies that are inside of a glass case pinned there, because you see that a lot. I'm thinking of like Valerie and her Week of Wonders, and I know almost every single time I see one of these movies, I'm just like, here's more butterflies. Oh, they're on the wall in All My Good Countrymen. Just it's everywhere. So again, it could be a culture thing or it could be a symbolism.
You could hatchet a horse, but pinning a butterfly is just one atrocity too far for Hanák, I think.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because, I was just trying to wrap my brains then, and maybe it was just, I had a bit of a false memory. Did I actually see a pinned butterfly in the movie? Because it would make sense given the style, because the style's very composed and very framed. The actors themselves are almost like butterflies within the frame, aren't they? I remember from reading an essay on daisies by Petra Hanáková, she said that apparently the line in Czech, "Would you like to see my butterfly collection?" is It's like a sexual invitation, basically. So I don't know how relevant that is to this film. I just took it as an image of freedom, really, because I think there is a kind of consistent interest in a number of Slovak films in flying. I guess you see it in Birds, Orphans and Fools. You see it a bit later in another film by Hanák, Rose-Tinted Dreams from the mid-70s. There's a kind of constant motif in that of flight. And yeah, I just took it as another kind of use of the idea of flight as an image of freedom. Because I guess when you see Vladko for the first time, he's waving his arms around, isn't he, as though he's flying. And yeah, I just took it as meaning that, really.
I guess that's the old, would you like to see my butterfly collection? My mom used to tell me that when men were trying to pick up women, they would say, do you want to see my etchings?
I mean, I kind of walked away with the thought that everything is what you make of it, because of being an overall theme, because he and his ex-wife were inhabiting the same apartment, but having two very different existences. And I just felt like there throughout is, I mean, I didn't feel that it was explained in depth, but the idea that he had been someone in a place of authority in communism, and possibly, I don't know if he would have been responsible in part for the deaths of people, or maybe just the terrible demotions. But it alluded to that repeatedly, of him having to make decisions. And the wife mentioned a few times asking if he felt that people reaped what they sowed. And that all seemed to come into play, but it was like the wife didn't do anything that he didn't allow, even though she was called a hussy and she was really thought ill of by the neighbors and the people listening with the stethoscope on the wall, which, wow, it's a good use of a stethoscope. But she was doing what she was allowed. Was she really a bad person if the guy's that letting her do it is inviting her to do it? He walks into the room with her lover and it's like, oh, you guys are fine. Carry on. Why would you stop?
Carry on, she says, as you see her looking at them in a mirror. I mean, the very first time you meet Marta, she's in a mirror. And then the next scene, she's also in a mirror. And then you go back to her and she's got, I don't know if that's a candle in front of her face, but her whole face is split in two with this line. And you're looking at her like, is it even? Is the side of her face even? Like this, it was such an interesting way to have this character. And you're just like, I mean, these characters having their faces split or, being reflected in mirrors. I'm just like, is this just how duplicitous all of these people are? Is just this like era of communism, like where you do have to worry about people listening to you through with the stethoscope? I mean, this is maybe the same year that The Ear comes out, I think. And, it's odd that this comes out in 1969 because this is post Prague Spring.
It was one of those films that was initiated before the invasion. So I believe it was first approved, I think, as a script in about 1967. And then I think they started filming it after the invasion, but in that period where it was still liberal before the normalization kicked in, really. So it was just in that weird window that you get of very like audacious and radical films that are made like after the invasion, but before things like tighten up again. And it's just such a strange period because, you get a lot of the most like outspoken and critical and experimental films in that time. And yet the invasion has happened. And I guess filmmakers know that the end is coming. Things, I think, in a way, almost like defiantly. In regard to the politics, I think it's very subtle, isn't it? It's very densely woven into the story. And what his job is meant to have been before is that he was part of I think they say the KNV, which was the Regional National Committees, which was basically a kind of an arm of I think came under the Ministry of the Interior. So basically they were part of the state apparatus. And I think Lauko makes a reference at one point to going to the countryside. And I think we could maybe surmise that he was involved in the collectivization of agriculture, which would have been in the early years of the communist regime. And at the end when he's going through the operation, I think those little fragmented sentences that are coming out are a confession of things that he had been involved in. And it doesn't really make it clear that exactly what he did. There are certain crimes that he either was complicit in or that he actually carried out. And I felt watching it again that when he goes to the slaughterhouse, that there's almost a kind of like a re-evocation of that, and that's possibly the reason why he feels sick in that moment, that maybe it re-evokes, because I think he mentions like I think there's a gunshot, isn't there, in the slaughterhouse scene, and then during his confession in the bed he mentions like a revolver, and so there's possibly some flashback there that he's having. But yeah, it's almost subliminal, I think, that whole level. Really, when you read like synopses of it, it sounds like it's very clear cut, doesn't it, really, that he was the former political functionary, but as you watch, it's difficult to keep a handle on that, really. And one thing I find really interesting is that this is coming in 1969, or it's in that period when they finally have the freedom to look back at the sort of the crimes of the Stalinist period. And yet he's actually a sympathetic character, isn't he, really? They could have made that kind of figure like the villain, and they could have made like the Josef Abrhám character the hero, but I feel it's almost the other way round in a way. I feel that Abraham's character comes off much less sympathetically than the character of Lauko, really.
But I think that's a nod to, surely at the time, Hanák couldn't make a movie where he boldly said, oh, this guy used to be a communist figurehead and now all these horrible things are happening. I guess he would have had to have done it subtly. His hands would have been a bit bound with that.
You're talking about what he might have been guilty of, and I love that as he's on his way to the slaughterhouse, there's that girl in front of him on the back of a motorbike, and he's flirting with her, and he's looking at a newspaper that says, no one is guilty. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I'm like, that looks like a headline from a trial, and probably not a show trial, because I imagine everybody was found guilty at a show trial.
Oh, that's right, because the driver was saying something about they were found not guilty because they weren't experienced enough with that. So how could they be responsible when they weren't even experienced enough to do the job? Like, they couldn't be expected to. I like the idea that depending upon which angle you see any character from, if you're the policeman, Vladko, this kind of loser hippie, possibly a ne'er-do-well wandering about, and if you're the neighbor, you think the wife's a hussy, but if you're her lover, you think she's amazing, and if you're married or your ex-husband is Lauko, you think that he's a good guy, but if you were the person who was on the receiving end of that gunshot all those years ago, he would never be able to be a good person. That's so far removed from what it says at the beginning of a loss of faith. What does any of that have to do with a loss of faith?
Marta's quite an interesting character, isn't she? Because she could have been portrayed very unsympathetically, because I guess on paper she is like a bad character because she's materialistic. She says that one like thing, she's very like upfront about that. But Lauko says in the story, because I think Lauko's narrating the story, is that he admires her desire for happiness. It's the willingness to just go out and grab happiness where you can. And although I can't remember if that line is actually used in the film, but I feel that is the tone in regard to her, that, yeah, she could have been an unsympathetic character, but somehow I think there is something about that strength of will that she has, and that straightforward desire to be happy. Why not? It's what we all want.
And yet it's sad that he's drawn to her rainbow coat and feels like he's drab and she's all colors. The reality is she was so unhappy that he was actually living this drab existence where he was walked on and was rather ambitionless, so much more satisfied. And also the actress, I don't want to butcher her name, Lucyna Winnicka. What a wonderful actress. Like, what a Polish Gina Rollins or Angie Dickerson.
Yeah, it's interesting that she's in it, isn't it? Like, There are a few occasions of that, but not a lot of, like well-known Polish or actors from other Eastern Bloc countries coming to do performances in Czechoslovak films. And it's great to see her, isn't it? Because she's famous from Mother Joan of the Angels and Night Train. And it's nice to see her doing not even a lead role. It's, I guess, second lead role, but still, it's nice to see her in there, I think.
And how 60s that you mentioned Night Train. So Night Train causes a big stir at the Cannes, 68, and then in 69 was the hoopla over 322. So 2 years in a row, she's the rebel.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember, and please, Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Fifth Horseman is Fear? Wasn't that also censored or pulled?
Fifth Horseman, I think, was okay, I believe. I think the issue that had was that whole weird thing that happened with the distribution via Carlo Ponti when they added the brothel scene. It's an interesting case of not being censored, but it's rather than things being cut, things were added. So, you could say another kind of betrayal of the original intentions. But
well, I have to thank you for connecting me with Radoslav Starenka from the Slovak film group, because he was able to send me a little bit more information about, speaking of being censored, about the censored version that we're watching of this and the non-censored version, which they call the Mannheim print, because it was smuggled by Fee Valent, I believe is how you say the person's name, via Vienna to Mannheim in the trunk of her car. And she got pulled over at one point, but they didn't search the trunk, which was pretty good. And she had this original print of the film in there. And he was able to share a little interview with me, and he showed, here's the original and here's the censored version. And it was 4 instances. It wasn't a ton, but you can kind of see when you're watching the movie now, there's a couple times where the film almost stops, or like I mentioned, the Apple shot being thrown in there. It's got to be easy to censor this film because it cuts away to so many things so often. And plus, one thing that we haven't said yet is that these scenes are very, very short. But this movie moves along. It's not like you linger on stuff. This is not like this plotting art house kind of thing. It's just like you're going from one thing to another, and there's no real transitions. You just move into another space, and like that also helps confuse people sometimes, where it's just like, oh, now suddenly it's this person talking over here. We've not met them before, but okay, here we are. We're now in a new scene. And a lot of the stuff that was censored was writing on walls about the Red Army and things. And it's just like, oh, okay. So even though Hanák agreed and made those changes, the film still ends up being banned. I think they showed it once, the censored version, and that was it. No more. And thank goodness there is this other version of it out there. I would love to see that restored. I'd love to see this whole movie restored and just out in a much easier to find version, because it's a great film. I had so much fun watching this.
It really was that. And what a marvelous story. I love the heroism of tucking it under her clothing and getting it out of the country.
It's sad that I think the Slovak side of the new wave really came to fruition just at that point when the invasion happened, and then suddenly we were seeing the film industry being reorganized, censorship reimposed, and I think it's amazing what they managed to do really under the shadow of the invasion and of normalization. Hanák, for me, I think is one of the few filmmakers, I think, who's able to really continue in fairly uncompromising vein into the 70s, really. I think he, albeit having his films banned along the way, I guess this was banned. He made a film a couple of years later, Pictures of the Old World, which also went through a similar process where he was asked to cut it. He cut it, but it was banned anyway. And that's a really beautiful film. That's an amazing kind of poetic documentary, which again is integrating like still photography with cinema. It's using like electronic music and classical music together. And it's a beautiful sort of poignant documentary about elderly villagers.
And it tears your heart out. The thing with the old man who is the plow horse and plows his own field with the yoke over. I'm like, oh my God.
That's such a beautiful film, but not in a kind of sentimental way. I think it's able to keep that balance of that sense of absurdism. I think, like Angela, like you mentioned, which is there, I think, in this film too, but also that sense of poignance and of respect for people too. I think he was really interested in life at the peripheries. And I think you see it in this film too, done in a kind of patronizing way. There is this sense of sympathy or empathy with outsiders, for want of a better word. And and in regard to absurdism, I think there are these nice little touches here of that kind of comedy of bureaucracy, isn't there? Which I guess is like a recurring feature throughout works that were made under communism. You have the little episode about the man's lost briefcase, don't you? Where you have the porter and then this man arguing about whose responsibility it was that this briefcase has gone missing. And then you have that story about, the collapsed house and then the workers not being held responsible for it. And you get a few of those nice little touches of just absurd realities of the time.
Well, just the absurdism of our main character who might be dying of cancer, but nobody's going to tell him that. And there's even that story about, they told this woman that she had cancer. She went home, gassed herself. They did an autopsy and she was fine.
It seems like he's so drawn to the outliers and how they're different from society. But at the same time, he's also portraying just how everyone is truly an outlier. Like when you get past the surface and the saccharine smiles, everyone's a little weird. Everyone is looking at the lady bending over or using their napkin to go catch chicken or doing God knows what. But also on the censorship, when I heard that there were 4 spots that had been censored from the original, I assumed that you must have sent us the uncensored version. I was so surprised at the things that were sent. I mean, it was the government that was censoring, not the MPAA. Totally different. Just given everything we saw at the slaughtering, I just assumed it was uncensored. It was like, oh no, it was just words on a wall. They didn't want the words on the wall. That was censoring everything we saw at the slaughtering. I just assumed it was uncensored. It was like, oh no, it was just words on a wall. Which I wonder, is it some sort of allegory on the loss of innocence or how horrible things just splatter onto everything around them? Or is that a 60s thing? Was that an edgy trope in the 60s? I don't know.
Showing the horse being killed 3 times. It's fine. I was distressed even just seeing those guys pulling that pig by the ears and hearing it squeal. Oh, this is really unnerving. And even a dead cat laying in an alleyway. And I'm like, ah. What was that documentary from, was it Chile? Watch as well.
Furnaces. Yeah, that's right.
Hour of the Furnaces. Yeah, because there's a lot of slaughterhouse in that one too. Whew, that one's rough to watch.
And I guess it was part of the sort of culture of happenings too, wasn't it? I think Jodorowsky, when he was doing those kind of crazy performances with the Panic Theatre, I think there was probably a lot of very dubious treatment of animals in that. And so, I think, Angela, as you said, I think it is part of that vibe. And I guess this is maybe a little bit too stereotypical of a reading, but I guess in regard to Slovak cinema, I feel this is more probably relevant to someone like Jacobisko. But I think there's an argument that I think Antonín Lím, the critic, makes in regard to him, where he says that somebody like Jacobisko is coming from a context where, animal slaughter and blood were just very much part of everyday life. I'm not sure how true that is of Hanák too. I feel Hanák has a sort of a rather different sensibility, but I think it certainly does tie in with that whole sort of 60s vibe, I think.
I don't like to put a lot of stock into listicles or lists of things. I'm very anti-high fidelity that way. But going back to that list of Slovak films of the century from film.sk, to see Hanák is in there in the first spot with 322, in the third spot with Pictures from the Old World. I didn't realize that The Sun is a Net was by a Slovakian filmmaker, because that, to me, has always been, I've been told that's one of the first new wave films. Like, that's what really helped kick off the movement. So many of these films on this list, from 67, of course, with like Return of the Dragon, but then you get quite a few films from 69. So like saying, as far as like they are in this wrong place at this wrong time, or like you get, Christoph Rocky at 67, you get Birds, Orphans, and Fools at 69, you get Celebration in the Botanical Garden, also 1969. Yeah, all these great films all coming out right at the wrong time to actually find their audience, because they're about to get censored and just shut down completely. It is remarkable, like you said, that Hanák was able to continue on and do his thing, but in a much different way. But I think that Pictures of the Old World might even be more subversive than this film.
I'm not a drug person, but when I watch these movies, I want to get a Wayback Machine and go back and just smoke some of the reefer in 69 and create something amazing.
It was so fun to watch, and I just love, again, the idea of these visual rhymes. I mean, even when you just talked about using the napkin to capture the chicken, I'm like, oh, well, it's kind of like blindfolding that horse before they hit it over the head.
Yeah, they take the time to be nice before something awful happens. And I hadn't thought about it, but it goes along with, are they being kind in a way of, oh, we're not going to tell him that he might have cancer because that would be stressful. So we'll just tell him he has to come in for another exam or another test. Is that kind of like putting the blindfold over as well?
One of the other rhymes I noticed was between those kind of gold painted bodies, where at one point you see the bodies trembling a bit and then it cuts to the elderly man's hand shaking. I thought that was a very nice little juxtaposition of, I guess it's like these kind of like primal, nearly nude bodies, and then this elderly man's hand. That was just a nice kind of juxtaposition of youth and age. And yeah, there's a lot of those little touches like that.
With the gold dancers, it seemed, I don't know if I was just reading into it too much, but it almost seemed like they were purposely past their prime, like just age-wise, body-wise, but they were still obviously capable. They were doing amazing things, even if perhaps more slowly than they had done them in the past. But isn't that like they sprayed gold on them? Oh, it's a good show. Isn't that what everything is going on there, of just spraying a little something on it, putting water in the orange juice? It's fine.
And you get that scene at the cemetery where it's like all the cracked faces too. It feels like everything is not in repair either. Being done in black and white, there are so many things where it just feels like this is dirty or disused. And sometimes in the cemetery scene, there's this big oval, and I swear it looks like, rather than a sculpture, it almost looks like a person sticking their face out of it. I was just like, what am I looking at right now? And I just, or that beautiful shot of the crosses where you get all the Jesus eye. I'm not sure, is Jesus a Greek or Latin? I don't know, but all the different Jesuses on the crucifixes going off into the distance, and just how rude the guy who's running the place is. And that he's like, oh yeah, here's your mother's grave. And he's like, no, it's not.
He didn't know where his mother's grave was. Like, had he not been to that town since his mother, that was just, it was one of those things that's just dropped in your lap with no explanations. I didn't know if maybe there was a tradition or something that I wasn't quite gleaning. So I don't know.
Well, the only other traditional thing that I was seeing was the whole idea of buying the fish and keeping the fish. I kept wondering, is this Christmas time? Because I kept thinking of the cremator. Yeah, if you're sensitive to animal cruelty or animal death, you're not going to have a good time with this one.
Yes, teaching Czechoslovak cinema to students needs you need a lot of trigger warnings, I think, especially in regard to the treatment of animals. I think if you've seen some of these movies a few times, it's easy to forget, and then you show it to somebody and then you realize, oh no, there's a really horrible scene. Even in something like Valeria and A Week of Wonders, there's that little scene with the polecat, isn't there, which is in the chickens.
Going back to the landscapes and stuff, like I said, everything seems so run down. But then you're talking about that influence of literature subtitle that comes up twice. And the first time we see that, it's a shot from, I believe, from a car moving across, and this landscape that they're showing, it reminded me a little bit of Iceland, where a volcano was and you get the steam coming up, because it feels like they're going across, but it's a very flat field, but all of this smoke coming up. And I'm just like, I don't know what I'm looking at. It doesn't look good.
I just love the sort of texturing of the imagery, really, because as you say, there is a lot of rundown imagery and there's a lot of cracks and crumbling buildings, and just as there is in pictures of the old world. And I guess on the one hand, that does represent this sense of decay. And yet I think his whole aesthetic embraces this love of grain and of texture, and the image itself is grainy and in a beautiful way. And I love the way that when you see like the snow coming down, it's animated, surely, isn't it? That it's not even like real fake snow.
The animation gave it just a charm that I loved, though. I noticed some parts sounded really jazzy, and it was like, wow. Sometimes when I'm watching older films, I feel like those kids in the reaction videos who were like, we're going to watch a video from the 90s. And how different can that be? And then they're shocked. They're so shocked that Salt and Pepper were singing about sex or something. And they're like, wow, I thought they were more like puritanical in the 90s. So I guess I feel like I shouldn't be surprised when I hear jazzy things in an Eastern Bloc film from 68. And yet, if it had been dubbed well and you just showed scenes of this to someone, they would have no idea that it was a Czechoslovakian. It looks like something from what we're familiar with as 68 or so, except for the blown out buildings.
Gerhardt is the composer, and I think, a lot of jazz stuff.
You mentioned the role of Schwankmeyer in this, and of course, Schwankmeyer was also involved in Pictures of the Old World and helped to construct that amazing kind of allegorical contraption. And I really love the way that I think he worked with a lot of the most interesting people from Czechoslovak art scene of the time. So I guess in relation to the music, in relation to the sort of visual artists that he was employing, he not only is a great artist in himself, Hanák, but I think he's also collaborating with other great artists and giving them something of a representation too. And you get this lovely fusion between different artists and different art forms. And I guess that too is ahead of its time as well, isn't it? I guess it's the idea of like multimedia forms where you're mixing film, you're mixing photography, you're mixing like plastic arts, and some of the images, they're really like assemblages, aren't they? Really like the things in like a grisly example, but like in the slaughterhouse, for example. And he clearly had quite a very refined awareness, I think, of other art forms.
Great visuals with him swirling around and just wearing those boots. Hanák does such a marvelous job of capturing freedom, like whether it's lovers in a field or even bucking the system at your employment. He does a good job of just always showing the rebellious heart.
Yeah, those jawbones or that collection of eyes, or I'm not sure what that is that's all hanging. Is that udders?
Yeah, I was thinking, is it tongue maybe? But it looks synthetic though, doesn't it, really? So I couldn't quite, I paused that a few times, but still couldn't quite identify it.
Yeah, and the very frank sexuality, talking about like, oh my gosh, this is 1969, and people are still having sex, and there's a lot of flirtation going on. I forgot that he also flirts with a woman in a restaurant as well. He keeps doing this thing where he's like nodding at her and waiting for her to nod back, and like I said, he's flirting with that girl on the motorcycle. And then, the relationship with Sesnik as well. I'm like, okay. Like I said, I wasn't sure if that was her being pregnant by him or not, but yeah, they definitely have a relationship. I don't think it's the same type of relationship that Marta and her boy toy have, but, yeah, it's very frank when it comes to that. And like the affair of Marta and, Josef Abrham's character, it's very out there. And I'm just like, okay. They seem to be having a really good time until the other woman comes into the picture. But until then, it's, they're having a lark even out in that field running around with the car circling them. And then you get some of those still images, and there's that image of her with the big fake mustache, and she seems to be having the time of her life.
I was thinking of how the cuckolding is alluding to the communism of, you're going to give me everything that I need, and I'm going to use you as a stepping stone. And so I'll be having a wonderful time, but you won't. Oh, I guess I hadn't really thought about that, but he was right to merge those things, because I don't think in the short story, I didn't get, obviously it did take place during communism, but I really didn't get that much heaviness on that aspect of it.
Yeah, please tell me a little bit more about the short story, because I did not have a chance to read it, and I know you two did.
Oh, God, Mike, it makes me feel so good that we read something you didn't.
Which is my fault, because I was too late. It would have been fair, because I think sometimes it's the most frustrating thing when you get this tantalizing nugget that just comes like an hour before you're recording something, and it's... So, yeah, I totally get the pain of that, yeah.
But yeah, tell me more about the short story. I'm so curious.
It was very much the core of the story between a guy getting diagnosed. But I think in the story, he knew he had cancer, right? I don't think it was ambiguous. At least I don't know. God, I just read it. I should know.
There's definitely nothing. I don't think there's anything about gallstones. So yes, I don't think it. I think it is cancer. I don't think that really resolves either in regard to the illness. And what I found quite interesting was how focused it was on the story of Marta, really. And so basically that story is the same, and the sort of the trajectory of her character is the same, where she dies in a car crash with the lover, or the lover gets injured, but he survives. Interestingly, though, the lover is quite different, because in the story, the lover, I think, is described as like a young author. He's like a budding writer, rather than, I think Abraham's character is meant to be a student, isn't he? Or although he seems to have a job as well, but definitely he's not, as far as I can tell, he's not meant to be a writer. And the lover in the story is much more sympathetic. He's really grief-stricken at the death, and he's much more sincere, it seems, in the relationship. And yeah, he is presented much, I would say, less sympathetically in the film, which is interesting. That's the part of the film that is most closely based on the story. The character of Silka is also there, and the colleague that he has, who's also who's also in a sort of a rather dire marital situation, and the one with whom he goes to buy the teddy bear at the beginning. So that stuff is there. But yeah, there's, as you say, I don't think there's really any references to politics or to Lauko's past, and definitely no Vladko, as far as I can make out. Yeah, the film added so much.
No, it's more like a slice of, I don't know what the timeline was, but like a few days of introspection as he's going through the motions of his life, and his ex-wife gets killed. I mean, after he's diagnosed with cancer, that's basically a much smaller bite than the movie is.
I love how they have to point out that she was killed, but the car's okay. Do you want to sell me your car?
That's in the story, but the film, I think the film takes that a little bit. I think the film plays a bit more again with that. It's that comedy of officialdom and of just really callous. I guess they're policemen, aren't they? I think. And yeah, that I think the film gets more painful comedy out of that than the story does. Yeah. He's more interested in the car and whether it can be resold. And
And I forgot that Josef Abrahams got the eye trauma from that as well. It's the same eye that was uncovered by those sunglasses as the eye that is bandaged later on, which I was like, Okay, it kind of reminds me of Chinatown a little bit with all of the bad eye type of things like broken glasses, spoilers for Chinatown, Evelyn Mulwray getting shot through the eye, like all of those things. To go all the way back when we're talking about playing with the form, I was surprised that there's no end to this. I always count on seeing Konek at the end of all of these movies. And then that moment after the credits are over, when we see a person on a bicycle and there's a wall, it looks like an apartment building that's being held up by, speaking of crumbling infrastructure, it's being held up by like these giant poles or logs with rocks underneath. I'm like, wow, that looks like that whole thing's going to collapse. I mean, that might be the building that they're talking about later on in the movie is that building we see at the beginning. And you get that still frame. Like the movie doesn't want to start at that point. Like it is a still frame. The person on the bicycle is sitting there for a while before it finally starts to move. And, that kind of, like I was saying, like, oh, it's easy to censor this movie because it is so odd at times. I mean, there could have been something there. I don't think there was, but, like later on when the one, thug at the beginning comes up to that woman that you're talking about, Angela, with the very weird paper eye thing. Like he goes up to her and the whole movie stops there too. And I'm like, okay, it's not just a cutaway to a still image. It's just the whole thing just stops and then it carries on again. I'm like, okay. And that was closer to an area of censorship. But like I said, I think that apple being put in there is what covered up the graffiti that they wanted to hide. And that, there's a character later on in the film that he meets. I'm trying to remember where it is, but that was also censored. And with that, I couldn't tell what was being censored because, like I said, that Mannheim print has German subtitles. I don't read German, unfortunately, but I could hear and even in the interview about that, they're like, oh yeah, he talks about the Beatles, and I could hear Beatles being said in, Czech, but I couldn't read what the subtitles were saying in German. So shame on me. I don't know if you picked up anything from that, Jonathan, but it was all Greek to me.
I could tell at the beginning, the censored part when they had the German subtitles, that they were talking about the thank you. I got the donkey part.
Watching this really makes me want to see more of Hanack's work. I love this whole thing of him coming from this documentary world and being able to bring that to this. And then I'm so curious about some of his other narrative works, just because I want to say it was a little while before he made another narrative film after this, but what a fascinating guy. And he's still around. He's still kicking. Tried to get an interview with him, but unfortunately he does not speak English, and he's in his 90s, I think. And yeah, he's not one for doing a whole lot of interviews right now. So I completely understand.
Maybe when he hits 100, he'll have a change of heart. Speaking of his other films, VYZVA Dutichta, he said that he met a writer who had written up accounts of schizophrenic patients. And so he recorded some things about them, but he didn't want to film the actual patients. Like he didn't want to film actual schizophrenics, just where they were and things they were involved with, which I guess that's novel. He went on to say that he was talking about a psych hospital he went to, that they would let, if the people thought they were royalty, they would let them walk around in costumes all day. But they also had one section that was very private that was called hell. They had a section for the men and a section for the women. I don't know if it's because the schizophrenics believed they were in hell or if it was just hell for the staff. It wasn't alluded to. So I don't know what about this is contained within the film, but I'm very curious just on that. But I don't know if you could raise curiosity any more than that to see a movie.
Apparently that one is called in English An Appeal Made into Silence. That rolls off the tongue almost as easily as the Sources of the Sea Attract the Diver, the short story that 322 is based on.
Yeah, I admire the propensity more in European cinema for longer titles. I think English language titling tends to go for the more snappy, succinct titles. And sometimes a longer title is fun, isn't it? I think. I like the fact that The Fruit of Paradise, for instance, in Czech is we eat the fruit of the trees of paradise, which I think is, yeah, I guess it's easier to make that kind of long title in Czech because there tends to be fewer words needed to say more. But yeah, we tend to shorten things in English language distribution. Yeah, I would really recommend Day of Joy. I think that's a really great example, I think, of his collage aesthetics and of just this sense of just pure anarchic bliss. And he made a documentary in 1990 called Paperheads. So I think if you are enamored of those masks that you see in the street in this film, there's a lot more of those in Paperheads. And I guess that was the film where, because it was made just as communism or just after communism ended, where he was able to say everything explicitly. And this is similar to the short film by Schwankmajer called The Death of Stalinism in Bohemia. It's got a similar vibe to that, where it's just this kind of cathartic release of just that kind of anger about the oppression. Yeah, this is a film that's kind of it's juxtaposing. You get these images of people in the street with these huge papier-mâché heads of the communist leaders, with documentary footage and testimonies of people who suffered under the regime. And yeah, that's a really quite harrowing, but also very aesthetically still very striking film.
It reminds me, speaking of the masks and artistry, I think one of the most horrifying moments of 322 is at the end when Vladko is actually telling him, this is an apple, this is a meadow. It's like, oh God, as an artist, how horrifying that you would have to hand a person your art and explain, that's an apple, that's a meadow, that's a tree. God, like how bad. I so wanted to see more of those photos or of those drawings.
You know what? I guess this is taking place at Christmas because you're talking about the trees. And isn't there a Christmas tree on like a piece of paper, like hanging up, and he kind of draws over it? Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I totally forgot about that. Perfect movie for Christmas. I think the real miracle is that not more people die. I'm surprised that it's just the wife that gets killed, because it feels like, you know, so many people make it out of this film unscathed. And we even have, I was surprised that he didn't die at the end of this because of the whole tit for tat thing that movies love to do. You know, I think about Parenthood, or some of the other films where it's like, okay, if somebody dies, and yes, I know that Marta dies, but I was thinking if Lauko dies, then we would get the shots of Sisnik's baby. But I guess Sisnik's baby is taking, because there's always that, one person dies, one person is born kind of thing in movies. And Marta dies, Sisnik has her baby, and then we see all those babies. And yeah, once you start seeing those babies, in fact, it's twins, I believe she gives birth to, or maybe not, but because the nurse is picking up the two babies, I assume that those were Sisnik's, but maybe not, because they show a ton of babies. And like you were saying before, Jonathan, all those babies with the numbers, they all have the numbers on it. Just like, welcome to the world. Here's your new number. And just that this whole movie is called 322, and which is coded for, cancer, but also coded for Lauko. It's like, here's your new number, just like you were saying, like Vladko's number is on his back. And we see that right from the get-go.
And boy, those babies must have been made of wrought iron, the way the nurse was like whooping them up. And it was like, oh.
I think there's another little reference to 322, isn't there? When I believe it's the young nurse, and she's talking on the phone about sweaters. And I think at one point 322 is a reference to is it the price? But definitely in some way it's related to these sweaters that she wants to buy. And yeah, that was like an interesting twist on the use of numbers.
What a great film. I am so glad to have watched this. I'm just really thrilled, because sometimes you never know. It's not that we've ever had a dud on Czetchtember, but sometimes it's just like, wow, this is really slow moving, or, it's just not connecting with me nearly as much as I would like a film to. But this one, holy cow, it grabbed me from the get-go, and I was with it all the way through. And then having this conversation, I'm getting so much more out of this.
Me too. Yeah, I was a bit worried that I would be a bit overwhelmed and I would lose my thread, which I do anyway, but I guess especially in regard to a film like this where there's just so many things happening. And yeah, having this conversation has been really great because it's drawn things out that I didn't see. And yeah, it's something to go back to, I think.
It's wonderful when you see a film like this, you're like, oh, you want to discuss it with someone, and who are you going to discuss it with? So thank you guys for being here to discuss.
So let's go ahead and take a break and play a preview for next week's show right after these brief messages.
Lotojský Viktor, poručík záloze. Zúčastnil se 6 zahraničního odboje. Pověřen správou majetku bývalé firmy Heidmann Schwarzbach.
Kdo vás sem pustil? Nerozumíte česky?
Vrazíte? Podívejte se na to morhu, jak se dívá. Já ji odsaď vykopnu.
Ničeho se neboj, Hanák.
Jste s ním spokojen?
Těšil jsem se domů. Když jsem se vrátil, lidi se mi tady stali za tu dobu úplně cizí.
That's right. We are wrapping up our abbreviated Czetchtember next week with a look at František Vlko's Adelheid. If you want to hear more of me discussing Vlko, please be sure to pick up the new second-run Blu-ray of his film Valley of the Bees, which features Robert Bellissimo and me on the commentary. Until then, I want to thank my co-hosts, Jonathan and Angela. So, Angela, what is keeping you busy, ma'am?
Still working on scripts, hoping to get something finished and out into the world.
And Jonathan, what new and exciting projects are coming our way from you, sir?
I've just written the essay for one of the essays, I should say, for the release of Adela Hasn't Had Supper Yet, which is now available from Deaf Crocodile in a really beautiful edition. So I think that's out now. And then I've also got a couple of things in the pipeline with second run, which I think haven't been announced yet, but I think those will be out. I think one is going to be out the end of this year and then the other beginning of next year. And I think the title is probably not a big surprise for given the kind of things that I'm usually working on and usually interested in. Yes, please look out for those.
Well, thank you so much, folks, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. I was doing some looking up of numbers the other day, and apparently the Czetchtember is always our lowest rated stuff. So thank you, especially to all of you people who are listening to this, because you're getting the good stuff here. So thank you for indulging and coming in and hearing us talk about this movie, which is pretty obscure, but is so much fun, and I hope that you have fun watching it. If you want to hear more of me shooting off my mouth, check out some of the other shows that I work on. They are all available at weirdingwaymedia.com. Thank you especially to our Patreon community. If you want to join the community, visit patreon.com/projection booth. Every donation we get helps the projection booth take over the world.
you.